Hello there, this is Soy, and today we're going to be talking about a mock interview. And in particular, this one is about the United Nations. I'm sure you're very familiar with the international institution, but what we're doing today exactly is we're getting you prepared to tackle the questions that come along with the mock interviews, because not only is it about answering direct questions about the excerpts themselves, but it also requires you to offer your own insights into the ideas that they give to you. So, I'm assuming that you've already read the excerpts and the questions, but if you haven't, you can go ahead and pause the video real quick, read them through. You can play it when you're ready. So, diving right into the questions. Question 1 says, what is the main idea and attitude of each excerpt? So you can see that there are 3 excerpts, so you will have to give 3 answers. And looking at the first one, you can see that excerpt A is quite objective in nature. It just tells you about, okay, it's slightly positive, but they're telling you that there are 4 great ideas that were kind of the basis for the decisions and the policies that the UN would make and take on. As you can see here, the 4 great ideas are peace, independence, development, and human rights. So these might be some good words to say in your answer to question number 1. And throughout the excerpt, they tell you why each of these ideas were considered to be the basis of the UN. And question 1 is not a big deal. It just wants you to, they're just trying to ensure that you know what the excerpts are about. So, after you've just basically restated the idea of excerpt A, you can say that it's objective, it's very introductory, it's not biased, and it's based on historical events. Excerpt B, on the other hand, it actually gives a sort of opinion. And it says that the first sentence kind of gives it away. I have the impression that the UN has lost a sense of vision, which the founding fathers had, and this is due to blah, blah, blah. So, excerpt B, the author of excerpt B, is obviously not happy with what the UN is doing or how decisions and actions have played out in the past. So you can say that the attitude is quite negative or critical of the United Nations. And excerpt B, the author of excerpt B, thinks that the intentions of the UN are good, because they say that the UN has lost something. So the UN has lost something that was good in the past. So first they mention the loss of vision is due to the primacy of economic analysis and econometrics. There's a loss of vision for peace. What else do we have? Well, in general, we see this word primacy. What does this word primacy mean? Primacy means the importance or the predominance of. So we're seeing that things like economic analysis, and in the last sentence, the liberal market economy. So these economic related terms are coming out of this excerpt. And we see that this author is not happy that these ideas of the liberal market economy, the free market, and economic analysis, etc., these are the biggest concepts that have been demonstrated to be important to the UN. And this is kind of strange because in excerpt A we saw that the 4 big ideas were peace, independence, development, and human rights. And while you could say, oh, economic importance is great among these ideas, in order to have peace, in order to have independence, development, human rights, a country needs to be industrialized enough, arguably, in order to be able to provide those 4 great ideas. But the writer here in excerpt B obviously does not agree that the market economy is the biggest concern that the UN has. So you can say that the main idea of excerpt B is that the UN has been, or the intentions or the interests of the UN has been diverted away from the original vision, the original intentions. And the attitude is, of course, negative, critical. And then finally, in excerpt C, the very first sentence says, the conclusion in the books is that development today is primarily benefiting those who are better off, rather than the very poorest. So, if you look through the excerpt, you can see that the attitude is not as critical as excerpt B, but it is not exactly praising the actions of the UN either. And excerpt C is offering more of an analytical or more of a thoughtful analysis into the failures or the shortcomings of the UN. We can't say failure because these are excerpt B and C are not saying UN is a failure. They're just pointing out some of the shortcomings of the institution and their ideas. So, we see that the author of excerpt C is concerned that the UN is benefiting only the more developed nations, perhaps. It says, rather than the very poorest. So the UN is there, for instance, to protect human rights. Maybe the UN, or this writer, does not believe that the UN is doing the best they can in order to help out these underdeveloped countries. Rather, they are trying to boost the economies of the more developed countries. And, I mean, you don't have to agree with anything that these people are saying, but you have to restate it. So make sure in excerpt C that you mention the fact that the UN, it seems like the UN has been attacking issues from from the perspective of a developed country. Countries that are, let's see, more well off relatively, that seem to, I guess, be concerned for underdeveloped nations, but in the end implement policies that would benefit themselves more. So although it's not stated, this is inferring to sort of a cycle where the poorest countries continue to be poor and the ones who are better off already continue to improve, or their situation is improving. So in the end of the excerpt, the writer is asking some rhetorical questions. How can we improve the situation? How can development be distributed? Will poverty persist? Etc. How can we go forward? So it is kind of open-ended for this one. So the attitude, you can say, is it is critical, but it is also very ambiguous as to what the UN can actually do. What is its potential? What is its potential? Is this sort of economic cycle kind of an inevitable concept that we have to accept? So you can say that the perspective of excerpt B is the most skewed as in it's the strongest opinion. C is a little bit of a weaker opinion, and excerpt A is just mostly objective. Let's move on to question number 2. It says, what could be an approach to address the issues presented in excerpt B? So the issues you should identify first, right? We see that in excerpt B, the author says the main, problem is the general loss of vision. The loss of vision coming from, again, the primacy of, the importance of economic analysis, of developing the economy, especially in developed countries. So now that we've identified the issue, you have to come up with a problem. So the approach. And this might be a little bit difficult, of course, if you're not so familiar with what the UN actually does or has done in the past. In general, of course you're aware that the UN has to be led by the most industrialized countries in the world. It is kind of inevitable. The UN was indeed, created by the more powerful nations of the world after World War II. And actually, it's it's not the most ironic thing, but it is something that people have to be consistently aware of, because the failure of the League of Nations, if you're familiar with the topic, it stems from the focus on the industrialized countries, the winners of World War I, which is why the League of Nations failed. It failed to include everyone. The League of Nations should be a cooperation of all the nations, not just a few nations, the most powerful ones of the world. Kind of defeats the purpose. So anyways, getting back, just kind of getting off track there. But one approach to this issue of, I guess, the loss of vision is to be able to sway the opinions of the more developed nations to go along with the original visions of peace, independence, development, human rights. You see that these ideas, these concepts, are things that industrialized nations already have. So in excerpt B, the founding fathers that they mention, the founding fathers probably wanted these 4 great ideas to be demonstrated in less developed countries as well. And that is one of the biggest goals of the UN itself. And in order, finally, getting to the approach to the issue, the approach in general should be to give incentive to the developed nations to create policies that will help out the less developed countries. Something that can be mutually beneficial. And although that's not a new concept, of course, but the interviewers, realistically speaking, the interviewers know that you are most likely a high school student, or a student who has graduated from high school very recently. They don't expect you to know exactly how to fix the issues faced by the UN. If you knew, then you would probably be working for the UN, right? So they just want you to realize that the people who are in power, the people who are able to solve these issues, are the ones who are more developed, the nations that are more developed. And in order to approach the issues, they need to have some kind of incentive. Every nation has self-interest, and that's just an inevitable concept in nature. So in order to most efficiently solve the issues, there needs to be some kind of benefit for the people who lead the UN, aka the developed nations. So, anyways, that was kind of a long-winded answer to question 2, but the issues are loss of vision to help the less developed countries, and the approach is to create incentive for the developed nations for a mutually beneficial relationship between less developed countries and the more developed countries. Finally, moving on to question 3, it says, in your own words, explain the statement from excerpt C. Just as a country at the center of the world economy can hardly be accepted to give up its privileges, how can one hope that dominant groups who combine capital and state power and who are ensured of international support will agree to play the game and hand it over to someone else? How could this be applied to the real world today? So, in excerpt C, this one sentence is very similar in nature to what we were talking about in excerpt B. A country at the center of the world economy. You can think of the big nations currently in the modern world that have the biggest economies, that are doing well in most of the 4 great ideas: peace, independence, human rights, development. Those are the countries at the center, right? So how can they be expected to give up privileges? What does this mean? If I am to be better off, then most likely somebody else will have to be worse off. That's just how the world works. And that is what they mean by being expected to give up privileges. In order for the conditions to be better in a less fortunate part of the world, the industrialized nations do have to give up something. They do have to give up sacrifices. They do have to invest a little bit more of their resources into fixing these issues. And that's why it says expected to give up its privileges. And it says, how can one hope that dominant groups who combine capital and state power, who are ensured of international support, will agree to play the game and hand over to someone else? Playing the game. Playing the game is basically what? It's being well off, it's maintaining peace, it's gaining independence or maintaining independence, sustainable development, and reassurance of human rights. So the game is basically life. How can we ensure the quality of life in one place, but also ensure improvement of the quality of life in other areas? Can we just improve everything at the same time? Not really. We have to give up a little bit. It's a give and take kind of thing. And that's what the statement from excerpt C is talking about. So how could this be applied to the real world today? In order to, I guess, boost the economies of some lesser developed areas, you don't have to be so familiar with this system, but some countries must invest in people from more developed countries must invest some into lesser developed countries, for example, in businesses. And this is one way, like, for example, multinational corporations, MNCs. This is one way that we can tackle these issues in lesser developed countries. And that's how you can explain in question number 3 for the application part of the last sentence in the question. So you can say that a country at the center of the world economy, for instance, the US or any other largely developed country in the world, they can be expected to give up some privileges in exchange for future prosperity. So if you invest in a lesser developed country right now, then maybe you'll have bigger returns in the future. And that kind of hope, reassurance, that can be one way to expect the sacrifices that come from the leaders of the UN. And anyways, so you can see that question 2 and 3 are very similar. You can give similar answers to questions 2 and 3. You can even identify the fact that question 2 and 3 are similar, so that your answer is allowed to be similar in both of the questions. Basically, incentives for the more developed countries. So yeah, I think that's pretty much it for these 3 questions here. And thank you for joining me today, and hopefully that helped you answer these questions. Hope that made you feel a little bit more comfortable with these mock interviews. And I'll see you next time. Bye!